5 days before my 30th birthday. I drove up the long gravel path that wound toward the Rowan estate. The invitation had sounded harmless enough family dinner before your big day, but the moment I walked into the drawing room, I knew something was off. My mother, Margot, sat stiffly in her silk blouse. My father, Edwin, had a leather folder in front of him, and my brother, Dorian, lounged in the armchair like he was waiting for a show. I barely had time to set down my purse before Edwin pushed the folder across the table toward me. "Callista, we need you to sign this," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, the same tone he used in court. I opened the folder. Inside was a contract thick enough to choke a shredder. The first page screamed its intention, a prenuptial-style agreement binding my inheritance, my company, and any future earnings into family oversight. I blinked at him. "This is a joke." Dorian laughed, low and sharp. "It's not a joke. Cal, it's simple. You sign, you stay. You don't. You walk out for good." My mother folded her hands like a queen on her throne. "We've invested too much in this family's reputation to allow chaos. Consider this a formality. Protection of family assets." I felt heat rush to my face. Protection from me. From poor decisions. Edwin corrected without blinking. "You've always been impulsive." The words landed like a slap. I thought of the years I'd spent working quietly, building something of my own, never asking them for help. And here they were, 5 days before my birthday, threatening to cut me out of the family unless I signed away every ounce of independence I had left. I pushed the folder back across the table. "You expect me to sign this tonight?" "Yes," Margot said coolly. "We won't drag this out, if you're part of this family. You'll understand the necessity." I stared at their faces, my parents' calm, my brother's smug delight, and felt the ground shift under me. This wasn't about protection. It was about control. And in that moment, I realized they had no idea who they were trying to control. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor, and said only, "I'll need time." Then I walked out, the folder still on the table, but their ultimatum clinging to me like smoke as I drove into the night. The memories of how we'd come to this point pressed in on me before I even reached home. Driving home from the estate, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. Their ultimatum wasn't new. It was just the sharpest version of a pattern I had known my entire life. My parents had built their lives on appearances. My mother's world revolved around luncheons, curated guest lists, and ensuring the Rowan name was whispered in the right circles. My father was a lawyer who believed control was the purest form of love. He raised me and Dorian to believe loyalty meant obedience. That belonging came at the price of silence. As children, Dorian was the golden one when he threw tantrums. They laughed it off as spirit. When he failed exams, they blamed lazy teachers. He wanted things, and they arrived: cars, trips, connections like the world owed him. I was different. I liked books more than parties, questions more than answers. When I suggested ideas or dreamed of building something beyond the family circle, I was patted on the head and told not to be naive. "You'll grow out of it," my mother used to say, her smile tight, her eyes already dismissing me. My father preferred sharper words. "Stop chasing fantasies, Callista. Leave the real work to us." The only person who never asked me to shrink was my grandfather. He'd sit with me on the back porch, listening to my wild plans for inventions, companies, ways of living that didn't depend on the Rowan name. He'd chuckle, sip his coffee, and say, "Don't let them put you in their box. Cal, you're bigger than that." When he passed away during my last year of college, I thought I had lost my only ally. Then his will was read. Quietly, secretly. He had left nearly everything to me, investments he'd managed for decades, carefully hidden from my parents. $7 million and a message sealed in his handwriting. "This is yours. Build what they can't control." That letter had changed everything. It was the seed of the company I now owned, the safety net that let me chase my own path. And it was the reason I refused to let my family's ultimatum destroy what I had built, because they still believed I was just the dreamer. Back in my apartment, I sat in the quiet and let the anger settle into something sharper. For years, I had carried the truth close to my chest, choosing discretion over spectacle. My grandfather's inheritance had grown under careful investments. My own company, Rowan Tech, born from late nights and stubborn belief, had pushed me into a position most people only dream of. Together, they put my net worth just over $10 million, but no one would guess it. I drove a reliable sedan instead of a luxury car, lived in a modern but modest apartment, wore clothes that were professional without screaming for attention. It wasn't humility so much as strategy. The less anyone knew, the freer I was to move without the weight of expectation or worse, exploitation. I thought of my parents' smug faces earlier, convinced they held the reins. They had no idea the horse had already bolted. Their arrogance thrived in the dark, fed by the illusion that I needed them, and maybe, in some way, my silence had allowed it. I had given them no reason to suspect, no crack in the story they built about me being the dependent, impractical daughter. I ran my hand over the desk where my files were stacked. Bank statements, contracts, valuations, all proof of the life I had carved out without them. I had wanted love without conditions, family without deals or signatures, but they had turned my birthday into a transaction, for the first time. I wondered if keeping the secret had been a mistake. Maybe I had thought my quiet success would eventually earn me respect. Instead, it had made me invisible. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. If they wanted a battle over power and money, then perhaps it was time they saw exactly who they were dealing with. I reached for my phone, knowing the first call I had to make would be to the one person who had always stood in my corner. The first call I made was to Lena. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright until she heard mine. I told her everything: the estate, the contract, the ultimatum. For a moment, there was only silence on the line, and then her outrage came spilling through. "They're treating you like property," she snapped, not even pretending to hide it. Who does that to their own daughter? I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of my window. Apparently mine. You can't let them corner you into this. Not when you have the power to end it. Her certainty steadied me. I promised I had a plan. Though at that point it was more conviction than detail. After we hung up, I called Gerald Knox, the only lawyer I trusted, the man who had handled my grandfather's estate and seen me through the early stages of building Rowan Tech. He was retired in name only, still sharp, still formidable. When I arrived at his office the next morning, he welcomed me with the same grave kindness I remembered. I slid the thick contract across his desk. He read silently, page after page, his mouth tightening the further he went. At last, he set it down. "This isn't protection," he said flatly. "This is predatory. They want you bound so tightly you'd need their permission to breathe." The validation was a relief. "Can we fight it?" He gave me a look that almost made me smile. "We won't just fight it, we'll rewrite the rules." For the next 2 hours, we drafted a counter-agreement. It was everything theirs wasn't balanced, precise, and ironclad. It secured my company and intellectual property, shielded my investments, and outlined terms that acknowledged me as an equal, not an asset to be managed. When we finished, Gerald leaned back. "This," he said, tapping the new document, "is what real protection looks like." I gathered the papers into my folder, feeling their weight in my hands. For the first time since the ultimatum, I wasn't just angry, I was prepared. As I left his office, I knew the next step wasn't the document itself, but deciding how and when to use it. Walking home with Gerald's counter-agreement in my bag, I felt the sharp edges of memory pressing in. This wasn't just about a contract. It was every moment that had led here, every subtle reminder that I was never enough in their eyes. I remembered Margot's voice at a dinner party years ago, cutting through the clink of glasses. Callista insists on building her little software company. Such ambition. The pause that followed was deliberate, her polite smile concealing the message cute hobby. Nothing more. Guests laughed softly, not at the joke, but at my silence. Then there was my father. When I landed my first round of funding, I called to share the news. Edwin listened, then replied, "That's good, but let's be realistic. You won't keep pace with the established firms. Stay practical. Cal." He never asked what the company did. He never asked why it mattered to me. And Dorian, he treated my success as a family wallet. "You'll cover my shortfall." "Right, it's all the same money." He said it casually, as if my hard work existed only to cushion his failures. He never once congratulated me. He never thought he needed to. One memory bled into another until the pattern was undeniable. They had never believed in me, never respected me. The prenup wasn't a sudden act of caution. It was the natural conclusion of years spent treating me as someone to be managed, not trusted. I reached my apartment door with my hands trembling, but not from fear. It was clarity. The cracks in our family had always been there. I had just pretended they were surface scratches. Now, under the weight of their ultimatum, the fractures were splitting wide open. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, knowing the next time I faced them, I wouldn't be the same daughter they thought they could dismiss. 2 nights later, I returned to the estate, folder in hand but unopened. Margot had called it a final discussion, her tone suggesting magnanimity, as if I were being offered a chance at redemption, when I walked into the study. My father and Dorian were already there. Margot followed moments later, holding a glass of wine like it was a prop in a play she'd rehearsed 100 times. They were smiling calm, certain. It was the look of people who had already decided the ending. "Callista," Edwin began, gesturing toward the leather chair opposite him. "Let's not make this more difficult than it has to be. You've had time to think. I trust you see this agreement is not only reasonable, but necessary." Dorian leaned back in his seat, his grin edged with mockery. "Honestly, Cal, just sign it. We all know you wouldn't last a year without the family backing you." Margot added her own quiet blade. "Loyalty is what holds us together. You've benefited from the Rowan name your entire life. This is about protecting that legacy." I sat, folding my hands in my lap, and let their words wash over me. Once, they would have stung. Now, I heard only the rhythm of control, the language of people who couldn't imagine being challenged. "I see," I said evenly, giving nothing away. Across the room, Ivy sat near the window, invited, perhaps, to witness my capitulation. She didn't speak, but I caught the flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She wasn't comfortable with this performance, though she wasn't ready to defy it either. Her silence was a small crack in their united front, and I tucked it away like a card yet to be played. Edwin slid the contract closer to me. "It's time to sign. Callista, we can't delay any longer." I placed my hand on the folder, but I didn't open it. Instead, I looked at each of them in turn, holding their gaze long enough to unsettle. "I'll consider everything you've said," I replied, my tone calm, almost indifferent. They mistook my composure for resignation, which was exactly what I wanted. When I left the study, their smugness lingered in the air, but so did my silence, a silence heavy with the plan I had yet to unveil. The dining room was staged as if for celebration, china polished, silverware gleaming, wine poured before I even sat down. My parents flanked the table like dignitaries at a summit, and Dorian lounged at the end with a smirk that told me he believed the matter already settled. I waited until the first course was cleared before I set my leather folder on the table. "I've reviewed the agreement," I said evenly, "and I've prepared one of my own." Margot's laugh was soft, almost pitying. "Darling, this isn't a negotiation. You're not in a position to dictate terms." Edwin leaned back. "Indulgent. We don't need revisions. Just a signature. I slid the counter contract across the linen. Read it. It's balanced. It protects everyone's interests. Dorian snorted. Balanced. Don't waste our time. You don't have assets worth protecting. That was when I placed the second set of documents on top of the contract bank statements, investment portfolios, and the valuation of my company. Actually, I do. Roughly $10 million worth. The silence that followed was almost tangible. Edwin's hand froze on his glass. Margot's smile slipped, her mouth parting as if words had abandoned her. Even Ivy, seated quietly to the side, widened her eyes. Dorian broke first, his face twisting. 10 million, and you never said a word. You let us plan. You let us think. I didn't let you think anything, I interrupted calmly. You assumed, and you dismissed me, over and over, because you believed I had nothing. His voice rose, no longer smooth but desperate. You were supposed to be the fallback. I counted on. He stopped. Too late. The truth already spilling out. I leaned back in my chair, watching the cracks spread across their expressions. For once, I wasn't the one cornered. The throne they thought they held so securely was shifting beneath them, and I intended to make sure it stayed that way as the night unfolded. The air in the dining room thickened after Dorian's outburst, but I didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, I reached into my folder once more and handed Gerald Knox the floor. He had been waiting calmly, his expression composed, as though this was the moment he had anticipated all along. He adjusted his glasses and spread the counter contract open. This agreement, he began, his voice steady, ensures equal protection for both parties. It preserves family assets, yes, but it also safeguards Mrs. Rowan's holdings, intellectual property, and independent business interests. It is comprehensive, balanced, and enforceable. Edwin bristled. This isn't how our agreements work. Gerald didn't flinch. Then perhaps it's time your agreements evolve. The leverage you believed you had is no longer valid. Your daughter is not dependent. She is your equal. Edwin's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment, the truth dawning with visible weight. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the recognition that their position had collapsed, that his authority had been undermined by facts he couldn't ignore. Margot leaned forward, her tone softening into something meant to wound less. But it was only another tactic. Callista. We're family. You don't need to prove yourself to us. This secrecy. These documents, why turn us into adversaries? I met her gaze evenly. Because you made yourselves adversaries the moment you demanded my obedience instead of my trust. Family isn't control. Family is respect. You've never offered me that, for the first time. Her composure cracked. The mask slipped just enough to show discomfort. Across the table. Ivy cleared her throat, her voice quiet but steady. She's right. Maybe it's time we start listening instead of assuming. Her words weren't much, but they were a fracture in the wall my parents had built around themselves. A reminder that not every bond in this bloodline was poisoned. I closed my folder, not with finality, but with resolve. They knew the ground had shifted, and I was no longer standing on the weaker side. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, I could see them scrambling for footing they no longer held. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around the Rowan family shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. At gatherings, I noticed the difference in how people addressed me. Aunts and uncles who once dismissed my work now asked careful questions about my company, their curiosity tinged with caution. Others, like Dorian, barely concealed their resentment, their greetings clipped, their eyes sharp with unspoken accusations. Gerald moved swiftly, filing paperwork that locked every door my parents might try to pry open. My assets were sealed under protections they couldn't override. My intellectual property ringed with legal fortifications. He handed me copies of the finalized documents with a rare smile. "You're untouchable now," he said. And for the first time, I believed it. The liberation was real, but it came wrapped in a quiet grief. Any lingering hope that my parents would one day see me without conditions evaporated in that dining room. Respect born of exposure wasn't respect at all. It was compliance forced by numbers on a page. I found myself replaying moments from childhood, searching for warmth that maybe had never been there. My grandfather's voice, steady and proud, became the only true anchor in that past. His faith in me had been the seed of everything, and now I understood why he chose to bypass the family altogether. Walking out of Gerald's office with the final papers in my hands, I felt lighter. Yes, but also alone in a way I hadn't expected. Blood had tied me to them, but the bond of love had been severed long before the ultimatum. My birthday was approaching, and with it the decision of how to mark this new beginning on my own terms. On the evening of my birthday, my apartment was filled with voices that rang with laughter instead of judgment. Lena had taken over the kitchen, insisting on cooking, while Ivy arrived with flowers she'd chosen herself, a quiet gesture that meant more than words. Around the table sat people who had walked beside me by choice, not obligation friends who knew me for my ideas, my stubbornness, my victories and failures. There was no polished silver, no speeches about legacy, no undercurrent of competition, just warmth, the kind I had longed for in my own family but never received. As I watched Lena and Ivy banter across the table, I realized how rare and precious it was to be surrounded by people who showed up because they wanted to, not because they expected to gain something. When the cake was set in front of me, its candles flickering, I didn't make the usual silent wish. Instead, I felt the certainty of a vow forming in my chest. I would never again dim myself to keep others comfortable. I would not fold under control disguised as loyalty. Blood may have tied me to the Rowans, but loyalty, respect, and love defined the family I chose. And sitting there, I knew I already had everything I needed. As the candles melted into soft pools of wax, I blew them out with a steady breath, not asking for change but sealing the life I had already claimed. My life was mine, unapologetically, and I would never hide my light again.